Alright, today we are talking about wells and groundwater contamination. A well is just simply a hole drilled down into the zone of saturation, where we can actively pump water out of the zone of saturation, but sometimes when we do this, it produces some side effects, like a lowering of the water table, and especially what we call the cone of depression. If you pump water out of the ground too fast, it causes the water table to slope down to the bottom of the well. This produces what we call the cone of depression. And it's not forever, it's not going to happen long term, but if we allow the water to recharge or rainwater to fill the water table back up, the cone of depression normally turns itself around and becomes a normal water table again. When there's long-term cone of depression, a couple things can happen. First of all, the water table is lowered enough that nearby wells might run dry. They're no longer in the zone of saturation. And also, if we're pumping water out of the ground for too long of a period of time, the aquifer itself can compact with the weight of overlying sediment, meaning the aquifer can no longer hold any more water. It's no longer porous. A special type of well is called an artesian well. In artesian wells, you don't need to pump the water out of the ground. It shoots out of the ground all by itself. A few special things you need to have an artesian well is either folded or tilted rock layers. And you also need to have the water table above the surface of the well. And if you have those two factors covered, what happens is just water pressure pushing down on the water table actually pushes the water down through the aquifer and up the well, meaning that water comes to the surface all by itself. Groundwater is one of the resources that we kind of take for granted, especially around here in Michigan with the Great Lakes and all of the rain and snow. Groundwater is not something we think about too hard. But in some areas, groundwater is actually considered a non-renewable resource. If they use it too fast, it can't be replaced and they will eventually run out of water. And we're going to see a couple specific situations where this is happening with the Colorado River. Another issue that comes up with groundwater is contamination. We've talked before about how confined aquifers are usually a better option for protecting against contamination. But pairing a confined aquifer with sandstone would be the safest type of aquifer. Sandstone has a fairly small pore space. It's still permeable, water can still move through it, but this small pore space is actually quite difficult for contamination to flow through. So if you start out with some contaminated water and it travels through a distance of sandstone, the contamination is actually going to be filtered out and removed naturally because of the sandstone aquifer. And this would mean just somewhere a short distance away you could pump clean water out of a contaminated aquifer. Lastly, we need to talk about what happens when groundwater dissolves and removes rock layers. Water is slightly acidic. Because of that, it can dissolve away rock layers like limestone. When that material is removed, it forms an empty space that we call a cave or caverns. But that rock layer doesn't completely just vanish, it actually can be redeposited in other caves, and we call it travertine limestone. And travertine sometimes makes really cool features. It can make stalactites or stalagmites. Stalactites are those big spikes from the ceiling, and stalagmites are the ones that come off the ground, just mounds of deposited limestone. And sometimes these caves, they get so large, they no longer support the surface. And that means the cave collapses. When the cave collapses, the surface of Earth sometimes collapses with it, producing a sinkhole. And sinkholes can either form all of a sudden with the collapse of a cave, or very gradually as limestone rock layers are eroded away by groundwater. Either way, a large land area full of sinkholes is called karst topography. All right, that's it for today's lecture. Make sure you're taking notes, make sure you're asking questions, make sure you're working hard in class. Thanks.